Welcome back to the Cyber Resilience Brief, the SafeBreach podcast. We dive deep into the real world threats facing modern enterprises and discuss how to build a security posture that doesn't just react, but resists. And all of that in 15 minutes or less. I'm your host, Tova Dvorin, and joining me as always is SafeBreach's own offensive cybersecurity engineer and resident threat tracker, Adrian Culley. Adrian, we've got a critical topic today. Recent events with the ShinyHunters threat group are a wake up call for the industry. Let's dive deep into who they are and why it matters.
It truly is a wake-up call, Tova. Good to be back. And again, hi to all of our listeners. Shiny Hunters Evolution, especially their merger with Scattered Spider, isn't just another news story. It signals a maturation of the cybercrime ecosystem into a specialized, highly efficient, as a service economy. Effectively, they're weaponizing the supply chain of attack. They've moved from selling stolen databases to a much more lucrative and coercive delayed extortion model. This isn't just about hacking, it's a sophisticated business model.
Well, let's unpack that. We've discussed before in previous episodes. And by the way, if you haven't listened to it, go back and listen to episode 17 about hackers on the dark web. We went a little bit into that there. But we have already established that a lot of hacking groups are well organized, have their own internal systems, and probably are about as organized as any startups. So, what has changed? What has made this merger and acquisition, so to speak, more sophisticated than the usual within the hacker ecosystem?
So, in their current form, Tova, particularly through the alliance with Scattered Spider, they're a tier one threat to enterprises across all sectors. They've created a formidable entity that combines Scattered Spider's mastery of initial access and social engineering, specifically vishing and SIM swapping, with Shiny Hunter's established infrastructure for data exfiltration and data extortion.
Critically, the primary threat vector has changed. It's no longer about just exploiting 0 days, right?
Exactly. Their primary threat vector is the systematic weaponization of social engineering against the human element of corporate security. They've strategically pivoted to target secure software as a service or SaaS ecosystems like Salesforce and Snowflake. Why? Because they can bypass robust technical defenses by turning an authenticated legitimate user into an unwitting accomplice. Remember, we've discussed before, folks, Scattered Spider don't break in, they simply log on.
So now, in some ways, they aren't just commandeering your computer or your infrastructure systems. They are commandeering you to be able to make the most of you. Is that right?
And we're all capable of being both targeted, and we've only got to click on the wrong link once, or they're also using IAB initial access brokers. Your credentials could have been harvested without your knowledge, gives a whole new definition to the phrase harvest festival, and sold on the dark web. And your credentials could be being used without you even being subject of a phishing attack. Uh, these are all very real, very dangerous attack paths. The 2024 Snowflake campaign was opportunistic and capitalized on poor security hygiene. They used credentials stolen by Infosteel malware in unrelated campaigns to gain access to victim Snowflake environments. The critical vulnerability there was the lack of multi-factor authentication on those accounts. They didn't need to hack Snowflake. Again, they just logged in.
It's a classic case of exploiting a fundamental security gap. But the 2025 Salesforce campaign was a much more sophisticated attack on trust.
That's the key. The Salesforce attacks, tracked as UNC 6040 and UNC 6395, represent a paradigm shift. In Path A, UNC 6040, they used AI enhanced vishing to trick employees into authorizing a malicious zero auth connected app. This action, which is a legitimate function of Salesforce, issued a persistent access token to the attackers, completely bypassing multi factor authentication and other logging based controls.
Now, before we go into the second path, which is our most critical one, supply chain, and how insidious that is, can we just take a moment to remind our listeners what AI enhanced phishing is and indeed the concept of phishing? I'm not sure that we've actually dove into it before.
So, great question, Tova. We'll keep it simple for the moment. It's something we'll do a much more deeper dive on in a later episode. But you're familiar with phishing with a PH, which is a mixture of, in language, phishing with an F, but sending emails that are crafted to get you to click on a link to get access to you and malware. Well, vishing is doing that with voicemail. It's scary how many banks are still using voice identification and voice credentials. My recommendation to everybody is do not use that. Threat actors, they don't need very much of you speaking at all. An old answer phone message can be enough now for them to actually train an AI to sound like you. They're then using that trained AI to deceive people on things like help desks. And that's phishing. It's actually active AI-driven voice recreation. Very, very effective, very powerful, and very difficult to stop.
Wow, thank you, Adrian, for explaining that and for feeding my continual millennial nightmares of ever picking up a phone call from someone I don't know. Not going to help that, but okay. Let's circle back to the supply chain attack. It's even more insidious. Supply chain attacks in general are the biggest threat right now. Let's talk about how Shiny Hunters has exploited this to the nth degree.
So Path B, or UNC 6395, demonstrated their intent to conduct high-impact supply chain attacks. It's where the crown jewels are. Security abrogation is a curse of industry at the moment. Outsource contracts, third-party suppliers. In this case, they compromise the third-party vendor sales loft. What happens is everybody assumes somebody else is responsible for the security. And if people aren't very, very careful to the point of legal contract and making sure it's explicit who's responsible for the security, what's going on is nobody's responsible. Shiny Hunters found in SalesLoft hard-coded OAuth tokens for the Drift application in a GitHub repository. They shouldn't have been there, but they were. They then used these tokens to access the Salesforce environments of over 700 downstream customers. They never had to talk to those final victims at all. This highlights that the new security perimeter is no longer the network firewall, but identity itself and the web of trust relationships between SaaS applications. Shiny Hunters are hacking concepts.
The core takeaway is that the adversaries are exploiting the human element and the legitimate intended functionality of cloud platforms rather than exploiting code vulnerabilities. In a sense, they're exploiting our trust in the systems and our reliance on them.
Exactly that, Tova, that they're exploiting the system itself. Their tactic, techniques, and procedures, TTPs, are a sophisticated blend, but they all converge on bypassing passing controls by exploiting the human. They use vishing, which is technique 1566004 if you're tracking to MITRE, spear phishing links, technique 1566002 in MITRE, and for defense evasion, they use OAuth abuse, T1556, and multi-factor authentication fatigue, T1621. Those of you not familiar with multi-factor authentication fatigue, it's basically a log-on bomb. They'll literally send a user to every device thousands of requests, and they're hoping that you just get sick of them and click on one. And the reason they do it is it works enough for it to be uh, worthwhile for them. And for Poistox exploitation, we've seen them deploy the async remote access Trojan, RAT, as you know, is the acronym, often delivered as a malicious screensaver, which is technique 1204002 in MITRE. They then exfiltrate data using technique 1530 using an automated tools, often in a low and slow fashion to evade volume-based detection, trying to stay off the radar as much as they can. And then they immediately attempt to delete audit logs to hinder instant response. If you're relying on logs to find out what went on, don't be so sure. These people are very skilled. They're connected to intelligence agencies. They're very good in their tradecraft of covering their tracks.
That's a truly daunting picture. For enterprise defenders and security leaders, the urgent question now is how do we defend against this? How do you defend against human psychology and behavior? Traditional security models are clearly being rendered ineffective, and based on the techniques here, they often avoid detection.
So the defense response must be multi-layered and a socio-technical strategy. We have to address the technology, the processes, and the people. If you like, the human firewall.
Indeed, as usual, it all comes back to human behavior. But let's start with the lower hanging fruit, which is the technology and the process layer. What are the hard technical controls for a platform like Salesforce?
Number one is OAuth and connected app governance. The single most critical defensive measure is to change the default OAuth policy from allowing any user to consent to an app to admin approved users are pre authorized. This immediately blocks the UNC 6040 vishing path because a non admin can't be tricked into installing a malicious app. Beyond that, implement phishing resistant MFA. Legacy MFA like SMS or Simple Push is vulnerable to SIM swapping and MFA fatigue. Organizations need to prioritize FIDO2 compliant hardware security keys for all users, especially those with privileged access to sensitive systems. Also apply the principle of least privilege rigorously to OAuth scopes. Enforce IP whitelisting to prevent stolen tokens from being used for external networks and require centralized secret management, centralized secrets management to prevent hard-coded API keys in source code, mitigating the UNC 6395 supply chain risk.
Thank you, Adrian. As usual, you've given us solid, actionable technical steps. Of course, as we've established, it's the human element which is central to the attack. How do we build what we'd call a human firewall, so to speak?
We need to evolve security awareness training from beyond generic email phishing. We must conduct regular simulated phishing exercises that specifically mimic the TTPs of ShinyHunters and Scattered Spider. The message to every employee must be unambiguous. IT support will never ever ask you to authorize an application, enter a code on a website, or provide multi factor access codes or passwords over the phone. And we need a clear out of band verification protocol. If a request is suspicious, hang up and call a known trusted IT phone number to verify. Never give a stranger the benefit of the doubt. Always give the benefit of the doubt to security. And that's exactly what the social engineering is exploiting. We all want to be helpful. In IT security terms, there is no benefit of the doubt if for an unexpected call or for a stranger.
Right. And going back to doubt and benefit of the doubt, this is why validation is so important. And that brings us to the core of what we do at SafeBreach, which is continuous security validation. So we've covered a lot of the elements of this here, but to bring it all together, Adrian, how do BAS, CART, and AAV specifically counter the Shiny Hunters threat model?
So we can boil it into a single phrase, Tova, whether technical or people, which is trust but verify. And this is why validation is no longer optional, it's essential. Shiny Hunter's success hinges on exploiting the seams between controls. We need tools that proactively test those seams. Back to our quilt analogy,
Right.
breach and attack simulation allows security teams to simulate the core TTPs of Shiny Hunters immediately and safely. You can test post-exploitation. Can our EDR or network controls detect the delivery and execution of the async MITRE technique 1204002 on a compromised endpoint? Exfiltration. Can our cloud monitoring tools detect slow and low data exfiltration technique 1020 from a SaaS platform or detect the use of known user agent strings like Salesforce multi-org fetcher 1.0? Continuous automated red teaming takes this further. Again, trust but validate. Since Shiny Hunter's TTPs are based on efficient automated attack chain, CART can validate whether a change in your security configuration, say a new firewall rule or an update to a Salesforce security setting, has inadvertently reopened the door to their attack. We need to constantly test the assumption that our controls are working.
What about the defense evasion techniques like process hollowing and asyncrat?
That's where adversarial exposure validation comes into play. AEV is a game changer for sophisticated malware. It tests the control's ability to stop obfuscated or evasive versions of the malware. For asyncrat, AEV can simulate the process hollowing technique, where the malware masquerades as a legitimate Windows process to see if the EDR is actually detecting the malicious code or simply trusting the legitimate parent process. If your security control fails this evasion test, the reality is that the control would fail during a real world Shiny Hunters intrusion. And this is how we live up to our name. The clue is in our name, Tova, Safe Breach. We do this safely.
Absolutely. And the ultimate recommendation is to adopt a zero trust model and enhance threat hunting in SaaS environments.
Absolutely. The zero trust model, never trust, always verify, trust but validate, must be applied to everything. And since the attackers are targeting cloud-native TTPs, we must treat our SaaS tenants like an extension of our own network, using BAS to simulate their TTPs and CART to continuously validate our detection and prevention capabilities in that new cloud perimeter.
The rise of shiny hunters is a critical inflection point, as you put it, Adrian. It's a call to action for every security team to move beyond perimeter defense and focus on identity, access government, and, as always, the human element.
And to constantly validate that your security defenses are working against a specialized, sophisticated, and adaptive threat actor like Shiny Hunters, hope is not a strategy. Continuous validation is the only path to true cyber resilience. And I guarantee we have not heard the end of the com story, the Shiny Hunters story, the scattered lapsus hunters story. There's much more to come.
And we'll be right here covering it with you, our listeners. Adrian, thank you for breaking down this complex threat and providing our audience with such actionable intelligence as usual, and look forward to following this as it develops.
My pleasure, Tova. Stay safe out there, listeners.
Yep, stay safe. Stay safe with SafeBreach. Until next time. The Cyber Resilience Brief is a SafeBreach podcast, executive produced by Tova Dvorin and Adrian Culley. Sound provided by Adobe Music. Editing done with Adobe Podcasts. Distribution and tracking provided by Podbean. If you enjoy the podcast and would like to learn more, please check us out at www.safebreach.com. SafeBreach.com. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.